Welcome to the Keeping It Israel podcast with Jeff Feuders, where Jeff and his guests talk everything Israel as it relates to Christian faith and the church. If you are a Christian and you stand with Israel, you will be encouraged and challenged by this podcast. And if you're not so sure about the whole Israel thing, you need to learn how your faith connects with Israel and why standing with Israel matters. Now here's Jeff with today's guest.
Well, welcome to the podcast today, and it is my honor to have on the podcast Dr. Jeffrey Garcia. Dr. Garcia, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Well, it is, as I said, truly my pleasure, and we're looking forward to get to know you a little bit and find out a little bit about who you are, and maybe that's the best place for us to start. Tell us a little bit about Dr. Jeffrey Garcia. I'll probably drop the doctor here soon, but I just,
That's fine.
I want to make sure people know that you're a smart guy, and it's great for us to be able to have you on the show today. So tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then maybe we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Well, again, thanks for having me. I am assistant professor of New Testament and Second Temple literature at Nyack College. Our campus is in Lower Manhattan, and I have been teaching there now I started actually in 2008 as an adjunct. In 2013, I came on to the faculty full-time while completing my doctorate. I am born and bred in New York City. I'm originally from East Harlem. If anyone knows anything about the city, they know that is a fairly rough inner city sort of part of New York. And the way I came to my field as it is now, or my studies, was I originally went to Nyack College as a student in 2000. Actually 2001, because my first semester was the same semester as 9/11. And the school was actually very close at the time to the towers. And I began studying there with a professor who had lived in Israel for 16 years, done his PhD at Hebrew University, and had just joined Nyack faculty, moved to New York, originally from Oklahoma, by the name of Stephen Notley. And I took Greek with him, and that was my first class studying with him. If you know anything about Dr. Notley, you know that if you are in a class with him and you touch on a particular subject, he will send them off on a rabbit trail into very interesting kinds of conversations. So of course, when Greek got hard that semester, we would throw in topics that we had learned were sort of the thing that would get him going. And the stuff that he said and the experiences that he had living in Israel for 16 years completely changed the track that I was on. I was actually on a pastoral ministry track. And that was based on a prayer that I had said as an assistant youth pastor years prior. I was praying to God, asking him that I wanted to know the Bible as well as possible in whatever way that is. And I had no idea of a PhD, MA, any of that stuff. Had no idea about languages. I may have said the prayer differently if I knew the amount of languages I would have to learn. But I met him, and it felt there was a pull there. What I describe as a calling in a new direction, and that was biblical studies. And I followed him around like a duckling does to a duck. Every class he taught, I would sit with him, ask for advice. And he's really the one that mentored me into the ability or the track to study, ancient Judaism and Christian origins, which is sort of how we describe the field. And he was the one who directed me to programs that would be good in this particular topic. And as a result, I ended up at NYU, which most people don't think as, where a Christian would go to learn the Bible. But they have a small department in Hebrew and Judaic studies, which is a completely Jewish department. I was maybe one of three non-Jews, Gentiles, in the entire cohort, and it was amazing. They were great. It was a great department. It was very different than the reputation that NYU has been given. There were people of faith there. They were serious about studying the Bible in terms of its language, culture, history, and that's exactly what I wanted. And that's eventually how I ended up sort of circling back to Nyack. Was I was studying in New York, looking for places to teach at, and Nyack had an open door.
That's amazing. And thanks for sharing that little bit about sort of the shift, the call, because I think that that is just so critical when we think about what it is that God has asked us to do. And I was really curious, actually. I read some of your profile online, and I thought, okay, so here's a theology student. I wonder how do you get to to be part of the faculty at the school that you studied at? And that's a great story. I think that it's so key. And this is probably just for free for anybody who's listening out there. It is so key that we key in on those little nudges from the Holy Spirit and the things that God is saying to us, about our direction for life. And sometimes we get so focused in on something, and we all have our own stories, but I never imagined that I would be the executive director of a ministry, a charity that supports Christian and Messianic ministries in Israel. I was a pastor for over 30 years, and then this shift happened in my life. So it's great to hear your story. Now, the topic of study, one of the things that we love to do when we travel around Canada and the U.S. and talk to congregations and teach is talk about the Hebraic roots of faith. Talk to me a little bit and to our listeners about how important it is to understand the words that Jesus in particular says to us, the words that the apostles say to us, the writers of the New Testament. How important is it for us to understand those words in the Hebrew context?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me, the whole track to studying this stuff, whatever it has multiple names, Hebraic roots, Second Temple period stuff, Second Temple period Judaism, ancient Judaism, Christian origins, whatever you might call it, it all saying the same thing, that we try to understand the New Testament within its own ancient context, right? However you might describe that. And for me, what the reason for me it was so important is that when Professor Notley, for instance, or someone else I was studying with, began to put particular text in their original context, it just shed so much light on the meaning of those passages that it just made sense that the right way to move forward was to try to put these texts back into their original ancient Jewish context, right? To find their Hebraic roots. The two examples that I use, because my New Testament students every semester are faced with a very inconvenient truth. And that inconvenient truth is that the authors of the New Testament assume that they have some sort of knowledge of the ancient world. So the two examples that I use are, one, when the Pharisees show up for the first time in each of the Gospels, no one stops to explain who they are. We just assume that they are, that we don't assume, we understand them as part of Jesus's world, but we don't know who they are. I mean, as Christians, we get sort of a traditional understanding of who they are, but we have no idea where they originated. How do they become part of society? They're not in the Old Testament. So where do they come from? Well, the Gospels don't tell us, because they assume that you will already know who they are because you are a first century reader, right? The second example that I use is the synagogue. Many of my students coming from a New York City background make superficial contact with various Jewish communities, so they know sort of what a synagogue is. They don't know what happens in one, but they know that Jewish people go on the Sabbath to a synagogue. So I go to Luke 4, when Jesus goes to the synagogue of Nazareth, and I say, why doesn't Luke stop to tell us what happens in a first century synagogue? Do any of you here know what happens in a first century synagogue? And they'll shake their heads, say, no, we have no idea. Luke assumes that you will have some understanding of what happens. So he doesn't stop to say, hey, listen, reader in 2020, reader in 2021, let me stop and give you a bullet point explanation as to what happens in a synagogue. He doesn't do that because he assumes that you will know, right? The way that I explain it to my students, and I have to give credit to, again, back to Dr. Notley for teaching me this, is the overriding principle in all of this, in the study of ancient Judaism, the study of the New Testament's context, language, faith, culture, these sorts of things, is the incarnation. That God chose to become flesh in a particular time, in a particular environment, speak a particular language, and practice a particular faith. And for most of us, I would say for all of us, initially, we are detached from that culture, from that space by 2,000 plus years. And it's our pleasure, our opportunity, our privilege to now in 2020, 2021, to have the resources to be able to look at those texts and begin to put them back in their original context and see what they meant there and then. The distinction that I use with my students is when we read the scripture, we have to understand that there's a difference between the idea of to and for, not the numbers, to us and for us. The scriptures were originally written to a first century audience, but they are written for us. In other words, they are written for us in terms of spirituality, in terms of meaning, in terms of teaching, in terms of authority, but they're originally written to the first century audience. And we need to respect that distinction so that we get the most meaning of what God is telling us in the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament.
Well, that's great. And I want to ask a couple things, and I hope I don't forget. I didn't write them down, but the first thing I want to ask, when you talk about, who it was written to the first century audience, but for us. I know this isn't your field of study or expertise necessarily, although Judaism would fall under this category. But in the Old Testament, there are so many prophecies, so many words that are made specifically to Israel, to the Jewish people. One of the things that I sort of butt up against all the time are people, and we've all done it. I did it as a pastor for so many years before I sort of fully began to understand this, is we take every promise to Israel and we extract that and contextualize it so that it's about us, so that it's about the church, this whole idea of replacement theology.
Yes.
And what I like to say, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, is we can take promises and apply them to our context and to our lives, but not at the expense of the original words and the original recipients of those words. In other words, God still has a plan for the Jewish people. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think replacement theology, as much criticism as it has received, it continues to exist, and I think it is a dangerous form of theology. In one way, the reason it's dangerous is I tell my students this as well, that the Bible is rooted in a real place, in a real world, real people, real issues, right? And to ignore that, you're in danger of being the interpretive authority. In other words, you interpret the scriptures based on what you perceive the scriptures to be saying and have no anchor into an actual interpretive foundation. Secondly, in terms of Israel, there is no indication in the New Testament that God abandons them and switches lanes and says, this is my new people. These guys I could forget about, despite the fact that I gave them all these promises in the Old Testament. Now I'm deciding to change the apple of my eye. We don't have any of that. I was just this last semester teaching a class on Paul and his letters, where we just read through Paul's letters, talked about them in their Greco-Roman context. And one of the questions we had to ask is, where Paul speaks sort of negatively about, let's say, the law, or, saying the law is sort of a curse, what is happening there? And how do we deal with that in light of the good things that Paul says about Israel in Romans, saying that Israel's not gone, speaking of Israel being the root of the olive tree. And I said, one of the things we have to contend with is, one, that God doesn't ever seem to give an indication, even in the New Testament, that he's left Israel behind. In fact, it appears that he plans to continue those promises that he has. The stuff that we get sometimes in Paul is a matter of who he's speaking to. So, for instance, in Galatians, where he's speaking negatively of the law, it appears to be that he's speaking specifically to non-Jews who are at the time not required to follow the commandments as per se, in terms of the way that Jewish people are observant. And when we have, and this is a much larger discussion, could probably be its own podcast. But when we see those things, we have to, when we read them in the context of when they were written, we get better understanding that these are not wholesale claims against Israel. That they are, once they are contextualized, we can see that there's a lot more nuance to the conversation that Paul and the early believers are having regarding non-Jews and Gentiles in light of what Israel is.
That's amazing. I like all of what you're saying there, and I think there is probably a longer discussion. I mean, I could do this all day, but I know that we don't have all day today. But hopefully, in the future, we can dive into some of those things a little further. Used a term a minute ago, Greco-Roman, and I specifically wanted to ask this question about the language. And so, in the studies that you do, early Second Temple and Judaism, where you talk about the roots of Christian faith, what kind of challenge does the Greek language present in sort of getting that full Hebrew understanding? Because I know this a lot of times is kind of thought about. You look at the New Testament and you go back to the original language and it's written in Greek. Help our listeners understand how you sort of make the connection back to the ancient Hebrew and to the Jewish understanding.
Yeah, so it's great question. In terms of the Greek, that is the language of our entire New Testament. However, first century Judea was at least a trilingual landscape where we had Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic functioning in that world, right? So, for instance, when Mark in Mark 8, and then the raising of the girl that is dead, he says Talitha Kumi. There's a conversation there as to whether it's Aramaic or Hebrew. For most people, it appears to be Aramaic. The same thing when he heals the deaf and mute man, and he says apophata. That is also an Aramaic word. And we also have Hebraisms that appear in the Gospels. So we have evidence that while the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, which is the common language of the time, the lingua franca, as you would, we also have evidence that there are at least sources to the gospel or gospel writers that may be thinking or preserving sources from another language, right? Because we have Hebraisms, what we call Hebraisms, that in the syntax of the Greek, you can see that it's not normal Greek and fits very well with biblical style Hebrew or Hebrew from the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's say. So we are able in those cases to say, maybe do a retro version of the Greek, which causes a lot of debate in New Testament scholarship, right? But the fact of the matter is that evidence suggests, in terms of the parables, in terms of what we have in the Gospels, that when Jesus was among his innermost circle, that the language he was speaking was Hebrew. It was not Aramaic. It was not Greek. And that really is the hardest hurdle to get over in terms of studying the New Testament on a language level, right? Because
Yeah.
people will accept the Greek because New Testament is written in Greek. They will accept the Aramaic because Aramaic has become the popular language of Jesus, but they will avoid, and there's a complex reasons why they do this, but they will avoid the idea, for the most part, that Jesus, his contemporaries, at least his disciples, were speaking and functioning in Hebrew. And when you get at the Hebrew level, it actually can shed different kinds of light on particular texts. But New Testament scholarship in general, and how we speak about the New Testament at a linguistic level, often misses that one thing. And it's a crucial thing, right? It's one of the few things that we can say that distinguishes Jesus as Jewish, as opposed to being Greek or being someone from farther east, an Aramaic speaker, right? If he speaks Hebrew, then he has to be Jewish. I'm not saying that there were non-Jews who could learn Hebrew or function in Hebrew, but for the most part, they had Greek and Aramaic. That was especially Greek was the main language of business, main language of commerce. But for someone to come out and speak Hebrew, like Paul does at the end of Acts, when he says he spoke to the people in their language, he spoke Hebrew. That is, it's one of the few markers that we have of someone being Jewish.
Thank you. That is one of the best explanations of that I think I've ever heard. And I want to just make sure I understood you right there. You talked about the fact that the way the Greek is used often perhaps isn't structured like a Greek speaker would structure it, but
right.
but structured more like a Hebrew speaker. Is that what you were saying?
Right. Yeah. So I see this. You'll see this in any multilingual environment. So like I have students in my classes who think in Spanish but write in English, right?
Yeah.
Or think in Korean and write in English. And you can see in their English by the syntax, you may not be able to tell what language they're thinking in, but you can see that they're not thinking in English, that English
Right.
is their second language, but they're thinking in their native language. So there are places in the Gospels where you can see that the Greek has either a oral or textual syntactical style, which means the way the words are placed, the way the words are connected. It just appears that they're functioning in a different language. And often when we go back to Hebrew sources, it's indicative of a Hebrew-speaking environment. It's indicative that some of the sources, I'm not advocating that any of the gospel writers particularly knew Hebrew. I'm not sure we can know that, but we can see whatever sources they're using, however they're writing. At some point, we're dealing with a Hebrew speaker.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's great. Now, let's shift gears a little bit. I think probably, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think probably we have some future podcasts that we could dive into some more of this stuff, as long as you're patient enough to, to help us with these things.
That'd be
But
great.
I want to talk a little bit about your involvement with Center for Holy Land Studies and how all of that came about. First of all, Amy Flattery is a mutual acquaintance of ours, and
Yes.
I think probably you know her a little better than I do. We've only connected on the phone and on Zoom, but Amy did a podcast with us back in November, December. And we talked a little bit about the experiences that happened through Center for Holy Land Studies, but how do you get involved initially? First of all, just answer that. How do you get involved initially?
Okay. Well, I was working at NYU on my doctoral studies, getting very close to the writing portion. I was adjuncting at Nyack College, and I was desirous to start doing trips to Israel, not only for my own edification, for my own studies and learning, but also introducing students to that world. Now, I had been to Israel several times since 2004. That was my very first time in Israel. And in 2012, the person that connected us, again, I'm going to go back to Dr. Notley. He connected me with the CHLS, because they were looking for teachers that would take groups overseas, introduce them to the land, participate in their learning, and was looking for teachers that specifically worked and were scholars in the ancient world, that could go there and say, okay, look at this stone here. What does this stone mean in ancient context, and why is it important to you? Because not every stone in Israel is important to everyone, right? For us, it was how do we introduce Christians to that world, and how do we allow them, even on their own, through our instruction, to come to an understanding that where they step, where they move, the language they hear, the food they eat, the places that they are going into are exceptionally important to their formation as believers. So they called me, and they didn't even need to ask. They should have just sent me an email with my first trip, because I was ready to go. But 2012, I did my first trip with them. It was a trip they have in May called Bible Lands, which is a 3-week trip primarily for college students. And that was a lot of fun. You can go on it and get credit. And that was my first trip. And from there, I've been working with them since 2012.
That's awesome. Dream job, right? I mean, if you could
absolutely.
do something part-time on the side, just kind of,
it's great.
Why wouldn't you do that? Now, of course, the last year has been a bit of a challenge. We all understand, but we're hoping for better days ahead. I read an article the other day that the Ministry of Tourism in Israel is hoping to start letting tour groups under very specific conditions back in possibly as soon as April, which seems a little bit optimistic to me. But hey, I'll hope along with them, because I miss being there, man. I agree. This last year has been awful.
This last year is the first time I haven't been there in any year since 2012.
Yeah. Well, I would have to say that's probably true for me as well. But I normally go 4 times a year, maybe. Maybe a total of about 12 weeks, depending on what we have going on. But It's been a tough year. Okay, so you help students understand sort of the roots of faith from the perspective of being on the ground in Israel. It's an amazing experience. Obviously, it's a lot of fun, but why is it so important? This is the question I want to sort of get to. Why do you feel that it's so important for theology students in particular? I mean, this is where I come from. We're trying to get a program like this going in Canada, and I feel like anybody who's going to be a pastor, anybody who's going to teach the Word, teach the Bible, needs to go and have this experience on the ground in Israel. Talk to me about why you feel that's so important.
Well, I will say this, when I started in 2012 with college students, I wasn't very good, because it is completely different from teaching in a class. The land being your classroom is just another world. And that was very formative for me, right? As a teacher, it made me a better teacher. It gave me greater understanding of the scriptures. And the reason that is because the Bible as a whole, from Old Testament all the way to Revelation, Genesis, Revelation, is so immersed in the ancient world, from the roads to the cities to how people lived to the language they spoke, right? And when you read the Bible detached from that world, or detached from ever seeing that world, you don't often get that at a reader's level. So if you're on your desk opening the scriptures and they're speaking about, Gibeah, well, who cares about Gibeah? Why are they speaking about Gibeah? Or someone speaks about Jerusalem, you may know it's important, but you may not know the things that make it important. Jesus traveling to Jerusalem, Paul in the temple, all these various things that are inundated in geographical locations. You don't get a sense of it when you're in a classroom. Now, for me, in my class, I give presentations for every book that we do, and I try to fill it up with as many pictures as I can, videos and pictures, to try to get, people familiarized with what I'm talking about. But it's nothing like being there.
Mhm.
When you
that's
can
right.
point, there's some things I can't explain in class. There's some things that if I tell my class, listen, if we were at the Temple Mount on the southern steps, right? Which are the steps where pilgrims went up and down to the temple, like Jesus and the disciples. This would make so much sense to you so much quicker. I could explain to you, look at this, and you would get it in an instant, right?
Mhm.
Secondly, to understand something about biblical life does not happen when you open a book. It happens by actually, now to be fair, we do use the bus a lot, but to walk where they walked, to be where they were, is something that is spiritually formative, intellectually formative, and it's impossible to do it anywhere else. I mean, I've also done trips to Turkey and Greece, and it's great to go to those places. Turkey's gorgeous, gorgeous. Greece, amazing. But it's not exactly the same thing. There's something about the land of Israel in terms of Jesus' environment, the disciples' environment, to see the hills of the Galilee, to see the plains of the Galilee, to drive from the Galilee to Jerusalem and then think to yourself, Jesus walked this. Jesus walked this length. He may have stopped, but he walked the whole way, right? It's just, I tell my students, and I think my students sometimes think that I'm just like a car salesman, that I'm just trying to give them the wrap to buy the trip. But I said, a trip to Israel for anybody, but especially for a student of the Bible and a theology student, it is life-changing. You can never go back to reading the scriptures in the same way again. As a matter of fact, going on a trip often turns the Bible 3D. It goes from pages to actual visuals of what that world was like. On top of that, being in the land of Israel itself with its people and its foods are something to do. It adds to the whole trip. It adds to the whole thing. There
That's
is
right.
nothing like, being at a site and opening the scriptures and being able to see before you where these things happened. For theology students, I know sometimes we have sort of, not everywhere, but sometimes we have this tendency for theology students to sort of be book learners, right? And learn theology in the books, and then, learn them in the Bible, read sources, this sort of thing. But I also think that theology needs to be somewhat based on practical things in the scriptures. We have so much theology in the Bible built off, how people lived and what they ate and what they said and all this other stuff, that making visual, physical contact with that is absolutely, it's uncomparable.
I agree. You don't have to do the car salesman thing for me. I'm in love with I'm in love with Israel, and I want everybody else to be too. I mean, that's a lot of the reason why we do these podcasts and why we have the ministry that we have. Of course, we go with another perspective as well. We're wanting people to connect with what God is doing in the land of Israel today, and the congregations that are there, the ministries that are involved on the ground in the land of Israel. That's who we're helping and supporting and sort of holding up their hands. But I think it's so critical, and we've made this case to some of the colleges here in Canada that are connected with my denomination. And we actually had our first trip was planned for last August, and we, of course, were not able to go. I had 35 students that were very disappointed, and so realistically we're looking probably now at the spring of 2022, just because of the fact that it was our first, and the fact that this the college is trying to figure out how to do this for credit and how to fit it into their calendar and all those kind of things. But
Right.
anyway, very big, huge disappointment that we couldn't bring these students, because
Sure.
I do feel so strongly that, I mean, it changed my life, it changed
Hmm.
my ministry trajectory, everything, the way I understood the Bible, all those things that you said.
Same here. Yeah.
What I love about reading the Bible now is that I can't read it without a picture in my mind. I
Hmm.
cannot, I can no longer just read those words and not picture where it happened, and some of the cultural sort of context that help to inform it. And I think that that's so important for any student of the Bible, any teacher of the Bible, any preacher of the Word. And so I really appreciate you kind of laying that out for us. And I hear your passion, and
Yeah.
I understand it because I've lived it myself. And if you're listening today, we just like go to Israel, whether you're a student of the Bible or not, go to Israel. But
Yeah. 100%.
if you're studying to be in ministry, if you want to teach the Bible and help people to understand it so they can apply the truths of Scripture to their own life, then you need to go. Even just um, a simple understanding of the feasts of the Lord, help us to see what Jesus came to do in so many ways. And I love being able to talk about that in the upper room, which we're not really sure is the actual upper room, but
Right.
it you stand there and you say to people, listen, this, when Jesus took the cup, when he took the bread, this wasn't sort of communion as we know it. This was
Right.
Passover. And
Right.
there's just so many things that are layered in there that tell us about what Jesus came to do. So, wow, this has been great. I want to just say
I
thank
agree.
you for taking the time today. And I think I'll probably, we'll probably pause here and think about future conversations. But I really appreciate you, taking the time. I appreciate Amy introducing us. And
Same here. My
I
pleasure.
guess if there was one last question that I would want to ask, it would be this: what's your favorite place in Israel to teach on? What's the one site that kind of really connects it all back?
My
Probably not
goodness.
fair because I didn't give you a chance to prepare for this because there's so many good ones. But you know what? Just
It
tell me
changes all
about one.
Yeah, it changes all the time. Let me see. I haven't been there in a while. Um, when we get to Jerusalem, it's really fun because Jerusalem has so many archaeological remains from the first century.
Mhm.
So, to go to the Mount of Olives and overlook Jerusalem and speak about Jesus's last week is fairly powerful. One of the things that's powerful is, if you go to the top of the Mount of Olives, you can see over Jerusalem, and then if you walk down what is part of the traditional, it's not the Via Dolorosa, but it's part of the way of suffering, but it's part of the way that pilgrims walk down on Easter down the Mount of
Mhm.
Olives, and they stop at a chapel called Dominus Flavit, which means the Lord wept, which is my wife's favorite place other than Tel Dan in the north, which is a nature reserve for the biblical city of Dan. That is,
Mhm.
she loves that place, right? But what we do is you get a beautiful sight, beautiful look over the Temple Mount because you're still higher in elevation. So you can still see over where the temple was. You can see now where is the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but right there where the temple was sitting. And we at that point make a connection to stuff that we have been teaching since the trip has been in the Galilee. So one of the things that we do on the Galilee that we touch on, and this hopefully will form itself into my next book on charity in the Gospels and ancient Judaism, is we keep touching on this idea that part of what the kingdom of God is all about is taking care of those that are in need. And we see it throughout the Gospels, even though we don't always pay attention to it. or don't see it in that way, but that all the elements of Jesus' ministry continue to be pointing in that direction, right? And that in the ancient world, we had more than one conception of what a Messiah was going to be. And Jesus draws his own messianic self-identity to some of them and pulls away from others. And the one that he pulls to is the one that tells the people of God to work justice and righteousness on earth. And that justice and righteousness comes in the form of helping those that are in need, which is why one of the great commandments is love your neighbor as yourself, right? And we see this throughout the scriptures. We see it in Matthew 6. We see it in the Sermon on the Mount, which is part of Matthew 6. We see it in Matthew 24. And when we get to Jerusalem, we say, even on his last day, one of the things that Jesus says in Luke is, had you known the things that made for peace. And that language that he uses there goes back to what we've been instructing the whole time on the trip in the Galilee. That what Jesus expects to some extent of his followers, and I'm not saying this is the whole kit and caboodle, but this is a large part of it, is for us to find a way, and he's given us a way, for us to find a way to work peace on earth through helping those that are in need, through helping those that are marginalized. And it's great to come down the whole trip. You spend 4 or 5 days in the Galilee, and you keep you sort of are scared that you're just beating a dead horse. And then you get to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is one of the places that there's 3 places in my life that I tell people that when I get there, I do a big sigh, sort of like a relief. I'm here, I'm happy, right? One of those places is when I come home and my daughter's here, my wife is here. All right, this is a safe place. The other place, funny enough, is Yankee Stadium, because I'm a huge New York Yankees fan, right? So it's great to just sit down and take in a game.
Yeah.
The third place is Jerusalem. Whenever we enter Jerusalem, I get that sigh, that sense. This is a good place, right? This is a safe place. It's a sigh of relief. Not that I'm worried about traveling anywhere else in Israel. It's just the culmination of our journey. And the way we set up trips is to experience God and Jesus on that journey. So that's why we go to the Galilee and then Jerusalem. So when we get to Jerusalem, to be able, not only in Dominus Flavit, but also the Church of All Nations, which is the foot of Mount of Olives, and in other places, to tie together that message is something that is very endearing to me, and I love to do.
Well, that's amazing. And I like that that's one of your favorite spots. The overlook there, the view is incredible. It's kind of halfway down the Mount of Olives. We're always, worried about some of our older pilgrims when we do those tours that they're going to slip on the hill. And but and of course there's also the gentleman there who loves to take your money if you're willing to give it to him. You've probably met the same guy that we have as well at the gates there. But anyhow, that's
part of Israel.
But here's the thing. That is kind of Israel. I was going on a bit of a track there. Oh, I know. You talked about this whole idea of charity in the Gospels, and I forget exactly how you referred to it, but you said it's going to be maybe your new book. I'm excited to hear about that. But it's a great segue into what our ministry is all about, because of all of the humanitarian aid and the help that we give for Holocaust survivors and so many who are in poverty in the land of Israel. Israel has one of the highest levels of child poverty in the world. And so it's a great way for me to just kind of remind everybody, that we're a ministry and we help these organizations who are in Israel. And if you want to engage with us in that, we would love to have you do that. Dr. Garcia, so great to have you with us today, and so nice to meet you. I want to just say thank you, and I hope that we can have some future conversations, maybe one about some of what you just shared, because I think that's a very sort of great way for us to talk about, what we do in the present tense as believers, and how that it stems from a lot of what Jesus talked about. But yeah, thanks so much for being on the podcast today, and God bless you. Happy New Year. I know that when people listen might not necessarily be New Year, but we just want to say Happy New Year to you and your family, and may God bless you in the work that you do.
Well, it's great to be here. I look forward to future conversations. I'm happy to meet you, and I've been reading about your ministries, and they're absolutely amazing and inspiring. And I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks, Jeff. Nice to meet another Jeff as well.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
God bless you.
Wow, what a wealth of information that Dr. Jeffrey Garcia has shared with us today. And I hope you've enjoyed this first podcast of 2021. I'm excited because I believe that this podcast will lead to lots of other times that we can learn together from Dr. Garcia, but also from some of his colleagues like Dr. Stephen Notley and others. And so I want you to stay tuned. This is going to be a great year for our podcast. We're looking forward to discussing all things Israel as they relate to the Christian faith and to the church. And so great to have you with us today. I was particularly interested in Dr. Garcia's comments about how the kingdom of God is so connected to helping those in need. And I want to just key in on that again, because as you know, we are a charitable organization here in Canada and also in the United States, and we are doing our very best to help ministries in the land of Israel who are doing the work of the kingdom there. We want to be able to help fund them and the ministries that they do and the practical needs that they have while we hold up their hands in prayer and continue to support them in this way. And so if you would like to be involved in that, I would encourage you, go to our website, firstcenturyfoundations.com/donate, and we would just be happy to be able to engage with you in that way. You can give here in Canada and in the United States and be received for your giving, and we're so grateful that you might think about engaging with us in that way. Thank you so much. God bless you today. It's been great to have you with us here on the podcast. And remember, as Christians, we stand with Israel.